In the brutal summer of 1980, 26-year-old Evelyn Marsh stood in the dust of her own driveway and watched the absolute devastation of Comanche County unfold under a merciless, white-hot sky. The heat that year did not simply arrive. It descended like a physical weight, pressing down on the flatlands of Oklahoma until the very air seemed to shimmer and crack. The earth baked into a hard, unforgiving ceramic, and the deep, rich topsoil that had sustained generations of farmers turned into a fine, choking powder that blew away with every passing gust of wind. It was a drought that older men who had lived through the Dust Bowl, spoke of with a quiet, terrified reverence. The rain simply stopped in May, and by July, the pastures were reduced to brittle, yellow shards of dead grass. Comanche County was cattle country, home to over 63,000 head of cattle, and that summer, those herds became a slow-moving tragedy. Without rain, there was no grass. Without grass, there was no forage. The creeks dried into cracked mudbeds, and the stock tanks evaporated into nothing but rings of salt and despair. Men who had built their entire lives around the pride of their herds were forced to watch their animals grow gaunt and listless, their ribs protruding like the timbers of abandoned ships. The local economy, always a fragile ecosystem balanced on the edge of the weather, began to collapse inward. Panic set in, sharp and bitter. In times of panic, conventional wisdom always dictates a retreat into selfishness, and the agricultural community of the county was no exception. Those few ranchers and commercial feed dealers who happened to have surplus hay from the previous year's cutting suddenly realized they were sitting on a gold mine. As the pastures died, the price of hay skyrocketed. It doubled, then tripled, then reached heights that were frankly obscene. A round bale of prairie grass that would normally sell for a modest sum was suddenly being hoarded, guarded like precious metal, and offered to desperate men at prices that required them to take out second mortgages on their family homes. The epicenter of this cynical commerce was the county cooperative, managed by a man named Harlan Webb. Harlan was the embodiment of the establishment, a man who measured the worth of a farmer entirely by the balance of their bank account and the ruthlessness of their business acumen. He was a tall, severe man who wore starched shirts even in the 100-degree heat, and he viewed the drought not as a community disaster, but as a long-awaited market correction. He stood on the loading dock of the co-op, watching the desperate ranchers come and go, and he dictated the inflated prices with a cold, detached satisfaction. He represented the skeptical collective, the loud voices of conventional wisdom who believed that farming was a war, and in war you exploited every advantage you had. But Evelyn Marsh was not playing by Harlan Webb's rules. In a county starving for forage, Evelyn was the anomaly. Her massive, tin-roofed hay barn, sitting at the end of a long gravel road, was packed to the very rafters. She had hundreds of heavy, tightly bound bales of high-quality hay, glowing with a faint, preserved greenness that seemed almost miraculous against the scorched brown landscape of the surrounding farms. While other farmers were scraping the dust for a single blade of grass, Evelyn had a fortress of feed. The community could not understand it. They whispered about her at the diner, they muttered about her at the hardware store, and they speculated endlessly about how a 26-year-old woman, working a modest acreage alone, had managed to secure such a bounty when men with decades of experience and massive lines of credit had failed. They assumed it was dumb luck. They assumed she had stumbled into a fortunate microclimate, or that she had inherited a fortune and bought the hay in secret. They could not fathom that her full barn was the result of a profound esoteric knowledge that had been quietly passed down to her, a knowledge she had applied with meticulous discipline while they had all been chasing easy yields. Let me tell you about the source of that knowledge. Evelyn did not learn her methods from the university extension agents, nor did she read them in the glossy agricultural magazines that Harlan Webb kept on his desk. She learned them from her grandfather, Silas Marsh. Silas was a man cut from a different era, a quiet, observant master of the soil who had survived the worst of the 1930s by refusing to farm the way everyone else did. He was an elder who spoke less than he worked, and he believed that the land had a memory, a long ledger that recorded every act of greed and every act of stewardship. Evelyn had spent her childhood walking the fields behind Silas, her small boots stepping exactly in the deep impressions left by his heavy work boots. She remembered the way he would stop in the middle of a pasture, drop to his knees, and dig his bare hands into the dirt, bringing a handful of soil to his nose to smell its life. He taught her that conventional farming was arrogant, that it assumed it could command the weather and the earth through sheer force and chemical inputs. The experts of his day had told him to plow deep, to leave the soil bare, to plant the highest-yielding commercial seed varieties regardless of their thirst. Silas had ignored them all. He told her once, sitting on the porch as a dry wind rattled the wind chimes, that a farmer must never plant for the rain they hope for, but for the drought they know will eventually come. He taught her the secret of deep root retention. While the neighbors planted shallow-rooted, fast-growing grasses that required constant rain to survive, Silas taught Evelyn to cultivate native, drought-hardy varieties. He showed her how to subsoil the pastures, ripping deep, invisible channels in the earth years in advance, so that when the winter rains finally came, the water would not run off into the ditches, but would be drawn deep into the subterranean reservoir of the soil. The neighbors had laughed at Silas when he was alive, just as they now laughed at Evelyn. They thought his methods were backward, a stubborn refusal to modernize. But Silas had left Evelyn something far more valuable than a bank account. He had left her a handwritten journal, bound in cracked leather, filled with decades of meticulously recorded observations about soil temperatures, moisture retention, and the behavior of native roots under stress. He had left her a set of well-oiled, heavy iron implements that were designed not to turn the soil over, but to slice through it, preserving the delicate web of life beneath the surface. And most importantly, he had left her a philosophy: you do not take from the land without giving back, and you do not take from your neighbor when they are on their knees. In the years leading up to 1980, Evelyn had followed her grandfather's journal like a sacred text. She had worked in total isolation, a young woman running a farm by herself, enduring the condescending smiles of men like Harlan Webb when she went to town for supplies. When she purchased her seed, Harlan had openly mocked her choices, telling her that she was wasting her acreage on low-yield pasture when she could be planting high-dollar cash crops. She had merely nodded, paid for her supplies in cash, and returned to her lonely work. She had spent hours on the tractor, dragging the subsoiler through the pastures, creating those deep, hidden channels. She had sacrificed short-term profits, living frugally, patching her clothes and repairing her machinery with her own hands, all to build the resilience of her soil. And then the drought came. The shallow-rooted grasses of the neighboring farms burned up in a matter of weeks, their roots turning to dust in the baked topsoil. But Evelyn's pastures, drawing on the deep, preserved moisture that her grandfather's methods had secured, stayed green just long enough for her to get a massive, early cutting of hay. She had baled it all before the worst of the heat settled in, packing her barn to the absolute limit. It was a triumph of patient, disciplined labor over the arrogant, generalized wisdom of the established community. Now, with the county in crisis, Evelyn held a king's ransom. If she had followed the rules of Harlan Webb, if she had listened to the conventional wisdom of the marketplace, she could have sold her hay at the inflated prices and made enough money to buy a new truck, upgrade her tractor, and secure her financial future for a decade. The dealers came to her, driving up her gravel road in their shiny trucks, offering her exorbitant sums for the entire contents of her barn. They wanted to buy it all, mark it up even further, and sell it to the desperate ranchers. But Evelyn looked at the dealers, looked at their checkbooks, and quietly shook her head. She refused them all. She knew that if she sold to the dealers, the hay would become a weapon used against the very people who made up her community. She remembered her grandfather's voice, telling her that a community is only as strong as its most vulnerable neighbor, and that debt accrued in desperation is a poison that rots a man from the inside out. Instead, Evelyn made a decision that sent shockwaves of disbelief through Comanche County. She put a hand-painted sign at the end of her driveway, and she spread the word through the local feed store. She announced that she was selling her hay directly to the farmers who needed it to keep their herds alive. And she was not selling it at the market rate. She was selling every single bale at cost. She calculated the exact price of the diesel fuel she had used in the tractor, the cost of the sisal twine that bound the bales, and the wear and tear on her machinery. She added nothing for her time, nothing for her labor, and absolutely zero profit. The price she set was so low it seemed like a misprint. When Harlan Webb heard about her prices, he actually laughed out loud in the middle of the co-op. He stood before a crowd of local men, shaking his head in theatrical disbelief. He declared that Evelyn Marsh was a naive, foolish girl who had no business running a farm. He said she was destroying the local market, undercutting honest businessmen, and that her bleeding heart charity would leave her bankrupt before the year was out. The skeptical collective murmured in agreement. They could not understand an action that was not driven by the accumulation of capital. They believed that her generosity was a sign of weakness, a failure to understand the brutal realities of the world. But the desperate families of the county did not care about Harlan Webb's economic theories. They only cared about the survival of their cattle, the animals that represented their life's work and their children's inheritance. And so, they came to Evelyn's farm. They arrived in a slow, heartbreaking procession of battered pickup trucks and rusty flatbed trailers. They were men with deep lines of worry etched into their sunburned faces, men who had not slept a full night in weeks. They were women who held their children's hands tightly, their eyes wide with the fear of impending ruin. They drove down Evelyn's gravel road, kicking up clouds of white dust, and parked near the massive tin-roofed barn. Evelyn met them there, day after day, in the suffocating heat. She did not wear the crisp shirts of the co-op manager. She wore faded denim, stained with grease and sweat, and heavy leather gloves that were worn smooth from labor. She operated the tractor herself, using the front-end loader to lift the heavy round bales onto the waiting trailers. The work was brutal. The temperature inside the tin barn regularly exceeded 115 degrees, and the air was thick with the suffocating dust of dried alfalfa and prairie grass. Every transaction was a quiet, profound moment. The farmers would step out of their trucks, holding out trembling hands with crumpled bills or hastily written checks. They were men unaccustomed to charity, proud men who felt the sting of their own failure, even though the weather was beyond their control. They would ask Evelyn, their voices thick with emotion, if she was sure about the price. They would tell her that she could ask for more, that they would find a way to pay it. Evelyn would simply shake her head, her face calm and resolute beneath the brim of her straw hat. She would take exactly what the hay had cost to produce, not a penny more. She would look them in the eye and tell them to take care of their herds, to keep their farms intact. She did not preach to them. She did not ask for their gratitude, and she certainly did not ask for their allegiance. She simply did the work, loading bale after bale, day after day, week after week. She kept a ledger in her pocket, a small, spiral-bound notebook. But unlike Harlan Webb's ledger, which recorded debts and interest rates and profit margins, Evelyn's ledger recorded only the names of the families, the number of bales they took, and the exact cost of the fuel and twine. It was a ledger of survival, a testament to the fact that she was holding the line against the total collapse of her community. I want to pause here and ask you to consider the sheer physical and emotional endurance this required. Have you ever stood in the center of a crisis, holding the one thing everyone desperately needs, and chosen to give it away while the entire world tells you that you are a fool? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of physical exhaustion, the kind that settles deep into the marrow of your bones, and still woken up before dawn the next day to do it all over again? That was Evelyn's life for 2 solid months. By the end of August, the impossible had happened. The massive tin-roofed barn, which had once been a fortress of green hay, was completely empty. The last bale had been loaded onto the truck of an elderly rancher from the far edge of the county, a man who had wept openly as he handed Evelyn his meager payment. The barn echoed with a hollow, dusty silence. Evelyn stood in the center of the vast, empty space, leaning on her pitchfork, her muscles aching and her hands blistered despite the leather gloves. She had saved thousands of cattle. She had kept dozens of families from going under. But in doing so, she had given away her entire safety net. She had kept only a small reserve, just enough tightly rationed bales to feed her own modest herd of cattle through the winter, assuming that the autumn rains would eventually arrive and bring the pastures back to life. It was a calculated risk, based on the historical weather patterns her grandfather had recorded in his journal. But nature, as Silas had always warned, is not bound by history. The autumn rains did not come. Instead, as September rolled into October, a second, incredibly rare and brutal dry spell gripped Comanche County. The heat did not break. It simply morphed into a dry, scouring autumn wind that sucked the last remaining moisture from the soil. The creeks, which had briefly shown signs of damp mud, turned back to concrete. The situation, which had stabilized slightly due to Evelyn's hay, suddenly became desperate again. But this time, Evelyn had nothing left to give. Worse still, her own situation became precarious. The drought stretched on so long that her small reserve of hay, the bales she had calculated would easily last her herd, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. She found herself cutting the rations, stretching the feed, watching her own cattle begin to lose their condition. The plump, healthy animals she had maintained all summer began to show the hollow flanks and dropping heads that she had seen in her neighbors' herds months earlier. This was the period of profound, isolating struggle. The adrenaline of the summer, the quiet satisfaction of helping others, faded away, leaving only the stark reality of her own vulnerability. Evelyn spent her days walking the cracked pastures, looking up at the cloudless, mocking sky. Her bank account was nearly empty, holding only the exact amount she had recouped for fuel and twine, which was not nearly enough to buy hay on the open market, where prices had surged again. The whispers in the community returned, louder and more vicious this time. The men at the diner, the experts who had always doubted her, felt vindicated. Harlan Webb, standing on his loading dock, openly declared that this was exactly what he had predicted. He told anyone who would listen that Evelyn Marsh had played the martyr, and now she was going to lose her own farm because she didn't understand basic economics. He said she was a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting sentimentality interfere with business. Let me tell you about the night Evelyn almost broke. It was late October, and the wind was howling around the farmhouse, rattling the windows and driving dust under the doorframes. She sat at her kitchen table, the light from a single bulb casting long, harsh shadows across the room. Her grandfather's leather-bound journal was open in front of her, next to her own small, spiral-bound ledger. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the weather forecast, which promised nothing but more dry wind. She knew that in 2 weeks, her hay would be completely gone. Her cattle would begin to starve. In that quiet, desperate room, the weight of the collective skepticism pressed down on her. Had she been a fool? Had her grandfather's philosophy of community and sacrifice been nothing more than romantic nonsense? If she had listened to Harlan Webb, if she had hoarded her hay and sold it for maximum profit, she could afford to truck and feed from out of state right now. She could save her own farm. Instead, she had given it all away to people who were now safely hunkered down while she faced ruin. A bitter, cold doubt crept into her heart. She closed the journal, buried her face in her hands, and wept. It was the only time she allowed herself to break. But the teachings of Silas Marsh were not easily discarded. The next morning, Evelyn woke before dawn. She washed her face in cold water, put on her worn boots, and walked out to the barn. She decided that she would not surrender. She would scrape the very bottom of the barn. She would forage in the deep woods for brush. She would do whatever it took, but she would not abandon the principles that had guided her. She began the slow, agonizing work of rationing the last few flakes of hay to her hungry herd. 3 months had passed since the day she emptied her barn. 3 months of relentless sun, of mocking whispers, and of quiet, terrifying decline. It was a Tuesday morning in early November. The air was cold, a sharp, dry chill that promised a bitter winter. Evelyn woke at 4 in the morning, the routine of hardship pulling her from a restless sleep. She made a pot of black coffee, wrapped a heavy canvas coat over her shoulders, and stepped out onto the front porch to check the sky for any sign of clouds. It was pitch black, the stars hard and bright in the clear sky. But as she stood there, blowing on her coffee, she noticed something strange. At the very far end of her long 2-mile gravel road where it met the county highway, there was a light. It was a single pair of headlights, turning slowly onto her property. Evelyn frowned. No one came down her road at 4 in the morning. She watched as the headlights began to move toward the farmhouse. Then, behind the first set of lights, another pair appeared, turning off the highway. Then another, and another. Evelyn stood frozen on the porch, her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. She watched in stunned silence as a massive, continuous line of headlights turned onto her road. It looked like a slow-moving river of light flowing through the darkness of the drought-stricken prairie. The low, heavy rumble of diesel engines began to vibrate through the cold morning air, a deep mechanical thunder that rolled across the empty fields. She set her cup down and walked out into the yard. The first vehicle pulled into the wide turnaround space in front of her barn. It was a massive, heavy-duty tractor pulling a 40-foot flatbed trailer. The trailer was stacked high with massive, round bales of premium alfalfa, wrapped in bright plastic, the kind of hay that was imported from states away, the kind of hay that cost a fortune. The door of the tractor opened, and a man stepped out. It was the elderly rancher from the edge of the county, the last man she had sold hay to in August. He walked toward her, pulling his hat down tight against the wind. He didn't say a word at first. He just walked past her, unlatched the heavy doors of her empty hay barn, and swung them wide open. Behind him, the second truck pulled in. Then the third. Tractors, pickup trucks pulling gooseneck trailers, flatbeds, farm trucks of every make and model. 40 vehicles in total, a mechanical armada of salvation, filling her yard, lining her driveway, and spilling out onto the gravel road. The noise was deafening, a chorus of idling engines and the hiss of air brakes. Evelyn watched, completely overwhelmed, as men and women began pouring out of the trucks. She recognized the faces. They were the desperate fathers, the worried mothers, the proud ranchers she had sold her hay to at cost. But there were others, too. Strangers she had never met. Farmers from the next county over, ranchers who had only heard the story of the young woman who gave away her fortress of feed when the world was burning. They had not forgotten. While Evelyn had been struggling in isolation, the community she had saved had been quietly organizing. When the second dry spell hit, and word spread that Evelyn Marsh was running out of feed, the very people who had survived because of her generosity decided that they would not let her fall. They had pooled their money. They had called in favors. They had driven across state lines to find hay where the drought had not reached. And they had brought it all back to her. No one asked for a ledger. No one asked for a price. They simply fired up their own loaders, backed their trailers to the barn doors, and began to work. They worked with a fierce, joyful determination. For hours, the yard was a blur of activity. Bales were lifted, stacked, and pushed deep into the cavernous space of the tin-roofed barn. Evelyn tried to stop them, tried to ask how she could ever pay them back, but they simply waved her off, smiling through the dust and the exhaust smoke. By the time the sun fully crested the horizon, casting a golden light over the cracked earth, Evelyn's barn was completely full. It was packed to the rafters, higher and tighter than it had been in July. It was enough hay to feed her herd for 2 entire winters. It was a fortune in forage, delivered freely, a physical manifestation of the debt of gratitude the community owed her. As the last trailer was unloaded, the elderly rancher walked up to Evelyn, who was standing by the barn doors, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. He reached out and placed a heavy, calloused hand on her shoulder. He looked at her with a depth of respect that transcended age and gender, recognizing her not just as a farmer, but as the moral anchor of their county. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply said, "Your grandfather would be proud of the crop you raised this year, Evelyn." Then he tipped his hat, climbed into his truck, and drove away. It was later that morning, as the convoy of empty trailers was making its way back to the highway, that the ultimate vindication arrived. Harlan Webb, the co-op manager, was driving into town in his spotless sedan. He had to pull over to the shoulder of the highway to let the massive line of 40 tractors and trucks pass. He sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, and watched as the farmers he had tried to exploit rolled by, honking their horns and waving. Harlan knew exactly where they had been. He knew exactly what they had done. He put his car in gear, but instead of heading to the co-op, he turned down Evelyn's gravel road. He drove slowly, the dust settling around his tires, until he reached the farmhouse. Evelyn was standing by the open doors of the barn, looking at the massive wall of hay. Harlan parked his car, stepped out, and walked toward her. His usual arrogant swagger was gone. His starched shirt seemed suddenly out of place, a foolish costume in the face of the monumental reality of the barn. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes scanning the impossible bounty she had just received without spending a single dime. Harlan Webb, the man of ledgers and profit margins, the voice of the skeptical collective, stood in silence for a long time. He looked at the hay, and then he looked at the young woman in the faded denim. The gatekeeper had been breached, not by force, but by an undeniable, overwhelming act of communal grace. "I saw the trucks," Harlan said, his voice quieter than Evelyn had ever heard it. "I saw them leaving." Evelyn did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him, her posture relaxed, possessing the quiet confidence of a master who has been proven right by the undeniable truth of the harvest. "They brought back what they borrowed," she said softly. Harlan shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound defeat and reluctant awe. "I called you a fool, Evelyn. I stood on my dock, and I told every man in this county that you were going to ruin yourself. I told them you didn't understand how the world works." He paused, swallowing hard, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. "I was wrong. You were keeping a different kind of ledger than I was, and yours is the only one that balanced when the rain stopped." He didn't offer to shake her hand. He knew he hadn't earned that right, but he gave her a sharp, respectful nod, a total capitulation of his conventional wisdom to her ancestral truth. He turned, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving Evelyn alone with the quiet hum of the wind and the massive, undeniable proof of her grandfather's philosophy. The subsequent decades were a masterclass in the enduring power of patience and integrity. The drought of 1980 eventually broke, the rains returned, and the pastures healed. But the memory of that summer never faded from Comanche County. Evelyn Marsh did not just survive, she thrived. When the agricultural crisis of the mid-'80s wiped out many of the farmers who had over-leveraged themselves with debt, Evelyn was secure. Her land was paid for, her machinery was owned outright, and her soil, nurtured by the deep-root methods of Silas Marsh, produced yields that consistently defied the county average. She became a figure of immense respect, a quiet elder statesman of the farming community. The people who had laughed at her now came to her for advice. The men who had mocked her grandfather's methods now asked her to teach them how to subsoil their pastures and select drought-hardy seeds. She never turned them away, and she never reminded them of their past arrogance. She simply taught them, passing on the knowledge just as Silas had passed it to her. Now, let me explain the true legacy of this story. When Evelyn reached her 70s, her hair white and her hands scarred by a lifetime of labor, she could often be found walking the fields with a young boy trailing behind her, stepping carefully in the deep impressions left by her boots. It was her grandson. She taught him how to smell the life in the soil, how to listen to the machinery, and how to read the weather not from a screen, but from the behavior of the birds and the color of the horizon. And when the time was right, she handed him a physical artifact. It was not a bank statement or a deed to the land. It was a cracked leather-bound journal filled with the cramped handwriting of Silas Marsh, alongside decades of her own meticulous notes, and a small, spiral-bound notebook that contained the names of 40 families who had once stood on the brink of ruin. The experts of the world, the men like Harlan Webb, will always tell you that success is measured in immediate profit, in the exploitation of scarcity, and in the ruthless accumulation of capital. They will tell you that generosity is a liability, and that the old ways are obsolete. But the truth, the absolute, unyielding truth of the earth, is far different. The dealer said she was a fool to give away her harvest. She gave away her harvest, and the community ensured she never went hungry again. The soil remembers, the community remembers, and a ledger kept in the currency of integrity will outlast any drought the world can throw at you.